When he left the orphanage on his 18th birthday, they told him he had inherited a worthless basalt cave on a forgotten piece of land. What he found inside would not only change his future, it would rewrite his entire past. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing, or that the world had already counted you out, I think this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and stick around, because we're a community of people who know what it's like to find light in the darkest places. Ms. Albright slid the manila envelope across the gray laminate desk. It made a dry, scraping sound, the only noise in the sterile office besides the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The sound of my life ending and beginning all at once. "That's it, Leo," she said, her voice holding that practiced, professional sympathy I'd come to know so well. It was a tone designed to handle tears, anger, or stony silence with equal, unflinching calm. For 2 years, she had been my caseworker. 2 years of monthly check-ins, of questions about my emotional state and my future prospects. Now the future was here, and it fit inside a flimsy paper envelope. I stared at it. It was thin, too thin to hold a future. "That's everything?" I asked. My own voice sounded foreign, a low rasp. "The discharge papers, your final stipend check, and the deed." She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the envelope's metal clasp. "The what?" "The deed to your grandfather's property. It's officially yours as of today. Happy birthday, by the way." The words were a perfunctory add-on, like a garnish on a plate of bad news. I didn't look at her. I looked at the envelope. My grandfather. The man was a ghost, a name on a form I'd seen once when I was 10. Thomas Reed. He'd been my legal guardian on paper until he died, at which point I became a permanent ward of the state. I had no memory of him, no photograph, nothing but a vague, second-hand story about him being a recluse, a rockhound who lived somewhere remote and died alone. "The property," I repeated, the word feeling like a piece of gravel in my mouth. "What property?" Ms. Albright sighed, a small puff of air that conveyed the mild inconvenience of this final piece of business. "It's a parcel of land, unincorporated territory up north, about 5 acres, according to the county records." She pulled a file toward her, flipping it open. Her glasses slid down her nose. "There's no structure on it, no utilities. The preliminary assessment, which was done when your grandfather's estate was processed years ago, describes it as geologically unremarkable, primarily composed of a basalt lava tube system. A cave, Leo." She looked up at me over her spectacles, her expression a careful blank. "You've inherited a cave." A laugh almost escaped me. It was a bitter, ugly thing that clawed its way up my throat. I swallowed it down. For 18 years, I had been institutional property. I'd slept in state-issued beds, eaten state-funded food, and worn clothes that were never really mine. I'd dreamed of the day I'd have something, anything, to call my own. A car, a small apartment, a dog. And here it was, a hole in the ground, a worthless, black, empty hole in the ground. "Is this a joke?" I asked, my voice flat. "It's not a joke, Leo. It's just what he left. There was no money, no other assets, just the land. Most of his personal effects were auctioned to pay for burial costs. This was all that remained." She pushed the envelope a final inch toward me. "The stipend will cover a bus ticket and a couple of weeks at a motel, if you're smart with it. My advice? Go to the county assessor's office wherever you end up. See if you can sell the land. Even a few $100s would be a better start than, well, than a cave. A better start. The phrase hung in the air between us. This wasn't a start. This was a punchline. I was being released from a system that had raised me with nothing but a check that would last 2 weeks and a deed to a rock formation. It was the system's final, perfect, bureaucratic shrug. I finally picked up the envelope. The paper was cool and smooth under my trembling fingers. It felt both impossibly heavy and utterly weightless. It was the sum total of my worldly possessions, my inheritance, my joke. "Okay," I said, just that one word. There was nothing else to say. I couldn't scream, I couldn't cry. The hollow space inside me had been carved out over years of practice. It was an old friend. Ms. Albright gave a tight, relieved smile. Her job was done. I was officially no longer her problem. "Good luck, Leo. Try to make good choices." I stood up, the legs of the cheap plastic chair scraping against the linoleum. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say goodbye. I just turned, walked out of her office, and didn't look back. The hallway was the same hallway I'd walked 100 times, but it felt different now. Every scuff on the floor, every faint smell of disinfectant and microwaved chili was part of a life that was already over. I was a ghost here now. Walking out the front doors of the facility was like stepping onto another planet. The air was colder, sharper. The sky seemed too big, a vast, indifferent blue. For years, my world had been walls and fences and schedules. Now, there was nothing but open space, and it was terrifying. I walked to the bus station, the envelope clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Or maybe an anchor. I wasn't sure which. I bought a one-way ticket to a town called Jasper Creek, the closest dot on the map to the parcel number listed on the deed. The bus ride was 12 hours long. 12 hours of watching the world blur past my window. The concrete sprawl of the city gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to rolling hills that slowly grew into jagged, pine-covered mountains. The further we went, the fewer cars I saw. The towns became smaller, sadder, clinging to the winding highway like barnacles. I didn't sleep. I just watched the landscape change, feeling like a man being ferried into exile. I opened the envelope. The stipend check was for $500. It felt like $1 million and nothing at all. The deed was a dense, jargon-filled document, but one phrase stood out. Lot 7, Ridgeback Quarry Territory. It sounded like the setting of a horror movie. I folded it carefully and put it back. The bus groaned and hissed, its engine a constant, laboring companion. I thought about the other kids back at the home. Some of them had families they'd go back to, broken or not. Others would drift into the system's less official arms, the shelters, the streets, the prisons. And me? I was going to a cave. I wondered if my grandfather had a sense of humor, a dark, twisted sense of humor. To leave his only grandson, a boy he'd abandoned to the state, a literal hole. Was it a final insult? A message? Or just the meaningless act of a dying, lonely man? The other passengers were a quiet, weary collection of souls. An old woman knitting a shapeless scarf. A young soldier staring blankly out the window, his uniform immaculate. A mother trying to hush a crying baby. We were all in transit, all heading somewhere we either desperately wanted to be or desperately wanted to avoid. I wondered what their stories were. I wondered if any of them felt as utterly, terrifyingly alone as I did. As night fell, The mountains became black silhouettes against a sky choked with stars. I'd never seen so many stars. In the city, the sky was always a hazy orange blanket. Out here, it was an ocean of cold, distant fire. It was beautiful, and it made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt before. The bus finally pulled into Jasper Creek just after dawn. It wasn't so much a town as a collection of buildings huddled around a single gas station and a diner with a flickering neon sign. The air smelled of pine needles and wet dirt. It was so quiet I could hear the buzz of the power lines overhead. I stepped off the bus, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the manila envelope tucked inside my jacket. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh, leaving me alone in the morning mist. A stray dog watched me from across the street, its head cocked. That makes two of us, I thought. I went into the diner. It was warm inside, smelling of coffee and frying bacon. An old man with a long white beard sat at the counter, stirring his coffee with a slow, deliberate motion. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, poured me a cup without asking. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," I lied. "Bus stop's that way," she pointed with the coffee pot. "Next one's not till tomorrow morning." "I'm not leaving just yet." I took a sip of the coffee. It was black and strong, and it burned a welcome path down my throat. "I'm looking for a piece of land, Ridgeback Quarry territory." The old man at the counter stopped stirring his coffee. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. His eyes were a startlingly pale blue. "Ain't nothing up at Ridgeback but Basalt and misery," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Old Tom Reed's place." My heart gave a small, painful thump. "You knew him?" "Knew of him," the man corrected. "He kept to himself. Folks said he was crazy. Spent all his time up on that ridge banging on rocks. Died up there, too. Took the sheriff a week to find him." He turned back to his coffee. The waitress looked at me with a new expression, a mix of pity and concern. "Honey, there's nothing for you up there. The road's washed out. It's a 5-mile hike, and there's no shelter. Whatever you're looking for, it ain't there." But it was all I had. I paid for the coffee, bought a few supplies at the general store, a flashlight, some water, a bag of dried fruit and nuts. The man behind the counter sold me an old topographical map of the area and drew a rough X where he thought the Reed property was. "Watch for cougars," he said cheerfully, "and don't fall in any holes." The hike was brutal. The washed-out road was more of a creek bed, a mess of mud and slick rocks. The forest pressed in on all sides, a dense wall of green and shadow. The air grew thinner, colder. After 2 hours of climbing, my legs ached and my lungs burned. I was a city kid, used to concrete and flat ground. This was a different world, a world that didn't care if I lived or died. I felt a growing sense of dread. What was I doing? I should have taken Ms. Albright's advice. I should have sold this godforsaken piece of rock and tried to make a life somewhere, anywhere else. But something kept me going. A stubborn, foolish flicker of... what? Hope? No, it wasn't hope. It was just the grim determination of someone with no other options. If this was the end of the line, I had to see it for myself. I found it late in the afternoon. The trees thinned out, and I stepped onto a wide, barren plateau of black rock. It was a stark, lunar landscape. The wind howled up here, a lonely, mournful sound. And there, at the far end of the plateau, was the entrance to the cave. It was a gaping black mouth in the side of the ridge, about 20 feet high and 30 feet wide. The rock around it was smooth, almost polished, like the throat of some ancient stone beast. It was exactly what I had feared, a dark, empty hole, worthless. I dropped my duffel bag onto the ground, the sound swallowed by the wind. I sank down onto the cold rock, my energy gone. I looked out over the valley below. The world stretched out in a panorama of green and gray, vast and empty. I felt a profound, crushing loneliness. This was my kingdom, a kingdom of rock and wind. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun begin to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. When it got too cold to sit still, I knew I had a choice. I could turn around, hike back to town, and get on the next bus to anywhere. Or I could go inside. My flashlight felt small and inadequate in my hand. I switched it on, its beam cutting a weak yellow cone into the encroaching darkness. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and walked toward the mouth of the cave. The air temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment I stepped inside. The wind died, and a heavy, tomb-like silence descended. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The floor was surprisingly smooth, worn down by eons of water or ice. The walls were columns of black basalt, hexagonal pillars packed together like a giant's honeycomb. My flashlight beam danced over them, revealing shades of dark gray and deep, flat black. The smell was of damp earth, of stone, of a place that had never known the sun. I walked deeper, my footsteps echoing in the immense space. The main cavern was huge, the ceiling lost in the darkness above my head. It felt like being inside a cathedral built by a nihilistic god. I swept my light around, looking for anything, a sign of my grandfather, a sign of life. There was nothing, just rock. So much rock. I was about to turn back, the despair finally winning, when my light caught something. A shape that wasn't natural. Tucked into a deep crevice between two massive basalt columns was a box. It was an old military-style footlocker, made of dark green metal, secured with a heavy padlock. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, but it was unmistakably man-made. My heart started to pound, a frantic, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. I scrambled over to it, my hands shaking. The padlock was old and rusted. I had no key. I looked around wildly, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. My eyes landed on a heavy, sharp-edged rock lying nearby. It was a desperate, stupid idea, but it was the only one I had. I picked up the rock. It was heavy, fitting awkwardly in my hands. I raised it over my head and brought it down on the padlock with all my strength. The clang of rock on metal was deafening in the silence. The lock held. I did it again, and again. My arms burned, sweat dripped into my eyes, but I kept hammering at it, fueled by a wild, desperate energy. On the sixth strike, there was a sharp crack, and the rusted shackle of the lock snapped. It fell to the floor with a clatter. I dropped the rock, my hands raw and bleeding, and fumbled with the latches on the footlocker. They were stiff, but I forced them open. I lifted the heavy lid. My breath caught in my throat. I was half expecting to find money or something valuable. Gold, maybe. The wild fantasies of a desperate kid. But it wasn't treasure. Not in that way. The box was filled with journals, dozens of them. They were thick, leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with a dense, spidery script. On top of the journals was a single, thick envelope, sealed with wax. My name, Leo, was written on the front in that same handwriting. I sank to my knees, my flashlight beam trembling on the open box. This was it. This was my inheritance. Not the cave. This, the story. With shaking hands, I picked up the envelope. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long. I unfolded it and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come of age. You have come home. I know you have questions. I know you must hate me. I pray that by the time you finish reading what I have left for you, you will understand. And maybe, just maybe, you will find it in your heart to forgive an old man who made a terrible choice for what he thought were the right reasons." The words swam before my eyes. I had to stop and take a deep, shuddering breath. The air in the cave felt thick, heavy with the weight of the past. I read on, my world shrinking to the circle of light from my flashlight and the spidery black ink on the page. My grandfather, Thomas, explained that he hadn't abandoned me. He had hidden me. My father, his son, had gotten involved with a dangerous criminal syndicate. He'd become their accountant, laundering money, and when he tried to get out, to go to the police, they killed him. And they killed my mother. They made it look like a car accident. I was in the car with them. I was only 3 years old. I survived, but they knew I existed. Thomas knew they would come for me, either to silence me or to use me as leverage. He was just a geologist, a man who knew rocks better than people. He didn't have the power to fight them, so he did the only thing he could think of. He made me disappear. He used his life savings to bribe a social worker, to create a new identity for me, to bury me deep inside the foster care system where no one would ever think to look for the grandson of a murdered accountant. He gave up his own son's child to save my life. He wrote that it broke his heart every single day. He followed my life from a distance, getting clandestine reports, making sure I was safe, but he never dared to make contact. It was too risky. The people who killed my parents were powerful, and they had long memories. "Leaving you the cave was not a cruel joke, Leo," he wrote. "This land, this rock, is the only thing of value I have ever known. It is a sanctuary. It is a fortress, and it holds a secret. The journals will guide you. They are my life's work. They are the key to everything. Don't trust the official records. Don't trust anyone who comes asking about this place. The truth is in the rock. The truth is in these pages. Your future is here, if you are strong enough to claim it. Be brave, my boy. Your grandfather, Thomas." I finished the letter, and the paper slipped from my numb fingers. I sat there in the crushing dark, the silence of the cave a roaring in my ears. My entire life, the foundation of my identity, was a lie. I wasn't an orphan left behind by neglectful parents. I was a survivor. I was hidden. I was, in a strange, painful way, protected. The anger I expected to feel was there, a hot knot in my stomach. Anger at him for letting me grow up alone, for letting me believe I was unwanted. But underneath it, a different emotion was stirring. A deep, aching grief for a family I never knew, for a grandfather who loved me enough to let me go. I cried. I sat on the cold floor of that dark cave, a place I had cursed just an hour before, and I wept for the first time since I was a small child. I cried for the parents I couldn't remember. I cried for the lonely old man who had spent his last years watching over me from afar. And I cried for the lost, lonely boy who had finally, in the strangest and harshest of ways, come home. The cave no longer felt empty. It felt full of secrets, of sorrow, of a love I was only just beginning to understand. It wasn't a worthless hole in the ground. It was a legacy. It was a puzzle. And as the tears subsided, a new feeling began to take root in the hollow space inside me. Determination. My grandfather had left me a map, and I was going to follow it. I want to pause here for a second, because maybe you've had a moment like this in your own life. A moment where the story you were told about yourself, about your family, turned out to be completely wrong. It's a feeling like the ground has fallen out from under you. If this story is hitting you, if you've ever had to dig through the past to find the truth, I want you to know you're not alone. Let me know in the comments if you've ever discovered a family secret that changed everything. This community is a place for stories like that, for people who understand that the hardest truths are often the ones that set us free. So if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're in this together. Now, let's get back to the cave. I spent the night in there. It was cold, but the footlocker provided a decent windbreak. I ate some of my dried fruit and read the first of my grandfather's journals by flashlight until the batteries died. His writing was a mix of geological observations and personal reflections. He wrote about the basalt flows, the tectonic shifts that formed the ridge, the unique crystalline structures he found deep within the rock. But woven between the scientific data were passages about his son, my father. He wrote about his pride, his worry, and his devastating grief. He wrote about me, speculating on what I looked like, what my voice sounded like, whether I was happy. Reading it was like listening to a ghost. The next morning, I hiked back to town, my mind a whirlwind of new information. I used some of the stipend money to buy more supplies, a better lantern, rope, a small camping stove, and enough food to last a week. I bought a cheap second-hand pickaxe and a shovel. The man at the hardware store gave me a funny look. "Taking up old Tom's hobby, are you?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. For the next 2 weeks, my life found a new rhythm. I'd spend my days in the cave and my nights reading the journals. The cave system was much larger than it appeared. The main chamber led to a network of smaller lava tubes, some of them tight squeezes, others opening into hidden grottos. My grandfather's journals were my guide. He had mapped the entire system with painstaking detail. His maps were incredible works of art, filled with notes on airflow, water sources, and mineral deposits. He described this place not as a cave, but as a living library of geological history. I learned about the different types of rock, the way lava cooled to form the hexagonal columns, the slow, patient work of water carving new paths through ancient stone. I was learning my grandfather's language, the language of the earth. But there was a constant undercurrent of urgency in his later entries. He wrote about being watched, about seeing unfamiliar vehicles down on the old logging roads. He was convinced that the people who had killed my father hadn't forgotten about him, or the financial records my father had supposedly hidden before he died. "They think it's here," he wrote in one of his last entries. "They think I have it. They don't understand. The real value isn't on paper. It's in the stone itself. I have to make sure they never find it. I have to make sure it's safe for Leo." That passage sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just about the past. There was still a present danger. One afternoon, I hiked into town for supplies and found a letter waiting for me at the general store's post office box, which I'd set up as my only address. The envelope was thick and expensive, bearing the logo of a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands were trembling as I opened it. It was from a company called West Rock Development. They said they were aware I had inherited the property at Ridgeback Quarry. They cited recent geological surveys that had flagged the entire ridge as structurally unstable and prone to collapse. They called the land a liability, and then they made an offer. They were willing to take the worthless and dangerous property off my hands for $5,000. $5,000. To me, it was a fortune. It was a ticket out, a new start, a real start. I could take that money and disappear. I could get an apartment, find a job, and leave the ghosts of Ridgeback Mountain behind forever. It was exactly what Ms. Albright would have advised me to do. It was the smart, sensible choice. The letter was designed to scare me. The legal jargon, the warnings of liability, the lowball offer. It was a predator's move. They were circling. I stood outside the general store, the letter in my hand, the choice laid out before me. The easy way, or my grandfather's way. I thought about his journals. I thought about the love and fear and hope packed into those spidery lines of ink. He hadn't spent his life guarding this place just for me to sell it for a pittance to the first vulture that came along. He had called this place a sanctuary, a fortress. He had trusted me to be strong enough to claim it. I walked back into the store, bought a single stamp, and wrote 2 words on the back of their offer letter. No thanks. I mailed it back to them. The walk back up the mountain felt different. It wasn't a retreat anymore. It was a homecoming. I wasn't just visiting this place, I was defending it. That night, I read the final journal. The last few entries were frantic, written in a shaky hand. He knew he was running out of time. His heart was failing. And on the very last page, there was a map. It was different from the others. It was a map of the deepest part of the cave system, a section he had marked as the heart. And there was a note. They're looking for money. They'll never find what's really here. The entrance is hidden behind the past. The flood of '87. 40 tons of rock and mud. They'll need machines to get through. But a boy with a strong back and a good reason can find another way. Follow the water. The sound will guide you. The flood of '87. I'd read about it in an earlier journal. A massive storm had caused a landslide, collapsing a major side tunnel in the western part of the cave system. It was marked on his main map as impassable. But this new map showed a different route, a tiny, narrow fissure that led behind the rockfall. The next morning, I went to work. I found the collapsed tunnel easily enough. It was a solid wall of rock and dried mud, just as he'd described. There was no way through. But to the left of the rockfall, almost completely hidden by a curtain of hanging moss, was a dark crack in the wall. It was barely wide enough for me to fit through. This was it. I took a deep breath, squeezed into the fissure, and began my descent into the heart of the mountain. The passage was tight and claustrophobic. I had to crawl on my hands and knees, my pickaxe and shovel scraping against the rock behind me. It was utterly dark, beyond the reach of my lantern's beam. But my grandfather was right. I could hear something, a faint, low humming, the sound of moving water. I followed the sound. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening up into small chambers, sometimes narrowing so much I had to exhale to squeeze through. It was terrifying. Part of me screamed to turn back, but the thought of my grandfather, of his faith in me, kept me going. After what felt like hours, the passage began to widen. The sound of water was louder now, a steady, resonant hum. I emerged into a vast cavern, and I stopped, my jaw dropping in awe. The source of the sound was an underground river, flowing through the center of the cavern, its water so clear it was almost invisible. The river had carved the chamber into a stunning gallery of rock formations. But that wasn't what made me gasp. The walls of the cavern were glittering. I held up my lantern, and the light fractured into 1,000 rainbows. The entire chamber was lined with crystals. Huge, breathtaking geodes, some as big as I was, were embedded in the walls. They were split open, revealing interiors of deep purple amethyst, smoky quartz, and brilliant, clear calcite. It was a treasure chamber, a natural cathedral of jewels. This was my grandfather's secret. This was the real value of the land. It wasn't money. It was this impossible, secret beauty. Tucked into an alcove on the far side of the chamber, I found his final legacy. It was a small, dry workspace he had carved out of the rock. There was a workbench, geological tools, and several locked cases. A key was hanging on a nail above the bench, with a simple tag that read, "For Leo." I opened the cases. Inside were the specimens he had collected. Not just crystals from this chamber, but rare minerals and unique fossils from all over the cave system, each one meticulously cleaned, catalogued, and labeled. And in the final case, there was a thick binder. It wasn't a journal. It was a legal document. It was a comprehensive geological survey of the property, complete with mineral assays and core samples. It was a professional, legally binding proof of the immense mineral wealth contained within the ridge, including the deed to the full mineral rights, which he had secretly purchased years ago. Westrock Development hadn't been lying about their surveys. They knew exactly what was here. They weren't trying to buy a worthless piece of land. They were trying to steal a fortune. My grandfather had outsmarted them. He had created an official record that called the land worthless, while secretly compiling the proof of its true value and hiding it where no one would ever find it. He had left me not just the treasure itself, but the weapon I needed to protect it. I sat there, in that secret, glittering place, and I finally understood the full scope of his love. He hadn't just saved my life as a child. He had spent the rest of his own life building me a future, a fortress made of truth and stone. He had given me a home. He had given me a purpose. He had saved me all over again. The months that followed were a blur of activity. I hired a lawyer from a town 2 counties over, someone with no connection to Jasper Creek. I showed him my grandfather's survey. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. We sent a certified copy to Westrock Development, along with a cease and desist letter. They never bothered me again. Their bluff had been called. The cave, my cave, was safe. I didn't sell the mineral rights. I didn't blast the mountain apart to get rich. That would have felt like a betrayal. Instead, I began to honor my grandfather's work. I spent my days exploring, mapping, and cataloging, just as he had. I learned to identify the different crystals, to understand the stories they told about the Earth's history. I used a small portion of my newfound financial security, a trust my grandfather had also managed to hide from everyone, to build a small, self-sufficient cabin on the plateau, not far from the cave entrance. It was the first real home I had ever known. I wasn't a recluse like my grandfather. I slowly became a part of the community in Jasper Creek. I'd go into town for supplies, and people started to know me. The old man at the diner, whose name was Henry, eventually started calling me Tom's boy instead of just new kid. The waitress, Sarah, would ask me about the rocks I was finding. I even brought her a small, beautiful piece of amethyst for her daughter. I was no longer an orphan adrift in the world. I was Leo Reed, the boy from Ridgeback Mountain. I had a name, a place, a history. Sometimes, late at night, I go back to the Crystal Cavern. I turn off my lantern and just sit in the dark, listening to the sound of the underground river. I think about my grandfather, a man I never met but know better than anyone. I think about the incredible, winding path that brought me here. They told me I inherited a worthless basalt cave, but they were wrong. An inheritance isn't about money. It's about the stories we're given, the legacies we're trusted with. My grandfather didn't leave me wealth, he left me worth. He left me a home in the most unexpected of places. He left me a second chance, a life I could build with my own 2 hands, grounded in the truth of who I am and where I come from. The cave didn't just save me from poverty, it saved me from the lie that I was alone and unwanted. It taught me that sometimes the things the world dismisses as empty and worthless are actually the places where the real treasure is hidden. You just have to be brave enough to step inside and turn on the light. And that brings us to the end of my story. But maybe it's the beginning of a conversation for you. What did this story teach you about the meaning of home, or family, or inheritance? The real lesson for me was that your past doesn't have to define your future, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the strangest packages. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. It means the world to me. This channel is a place for people who have been through it, who have had to fight for their second chances. If that's you, I hope you'll subscribe and become a part of our community. And please, share your own story in the comments. Have you ever inherited something that seemed worthless, but turned out to be priceless? Have you ever found your home in a place no one else could see the value in? I read every comment, because your stories matter. You matter. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.